On the night of July 20th, 2000, Misty Morse left her house for the last time. At just 22 years old, she didn't seem to have any reason to just vanish. She was a regular girl, hardworking, with no history of serious problems or enemies that might suggest something shady was going on. But that night, something completely unexpected happened. And for 3 days, nobody noticed. Misty was born in Springfield, Ohio, in 1978. As a kid, she watched her family fall apart when her parents split up. She moved with her mom to Indian Harbor Beach, Florida, a small, laid-back coastal town. Growing up among the beaches and the salty ocean breeze, she developed a strong bond with nature, spending most of her free time surfing, swimming, and soaking up the sun with her friends. She was friendly, outgoing, and just went with the flow. But like many young people her age, she hadn't yet figured out what she wanted to do with her life. After a few odd jobs and changing plans, she enrolled at a local college while working as a waitress at a neighborhood cafe. July 20th went by without any big surprises. Misty worked her shift, came home, and chatted with her mom for a bit. By all accounts, she was calm and didn't act any different than usual. Around 10 p.m., she got a brief phone call. After hanging up, she told her mom she was heading out and would be back later. She left through the front door and, from that point on, just disappeared. The next morning, when Misty's mom came home from work and didn't find her, she wasn't immediately alarmed. Her daughter had a busy routine and sometimes spent the night at friends' houses. Besides, they only shared one car, and it was still parked in the garage at that moment. That kind of suggested that wherever Misty was, she'd probably have found another way to get around. However, as days passed, her absence started to seem a lot more odd. Misty didn't check in the next day, nor did she pick up the car when she was supposed to. Her mom's attempts to call her went straight to voicemail. That maternal instinct, initially drowned out by logic, turned into a growing sense of worry. By the third day, with no trace of her daughter, the fear became unbearable. Her mom decided to go to the police station to report her missing. But before she could file the report, something totally unexpected happened. Some officers knocked on her door with devastating news. They had found Misty's body. The body had been discovered by a retired judge who lived in a house near a riverbank in Rhode Island. Like any other day, he had stepped out to mow the lawn when something in the water caught his eye. At first, he thought it was an animal carcass, maybe a deer or a large dog swept along by the current. But as he got closer, the stench of decay made it clear this wasn't just any animal. That's when he realized the grim truth. It was a human body. The police were called, and the area was quickly cordoned off. When the officers pulled the body from the water, the severity of the crime became evident. The victim was naked, with her hands and ankles tied up with nautical rope, the same kind used on boats. Her mouth and part of her face were covered with several layers of strong adhesive tape, the kind typically used to seal leaks on ships. On her feet, plastic bags had been tied on, probably to keep the body from surfacing. But something had gone wrong. The bags were torn, which allowed the body to float until it was found. Initial forensics indicated that the body had been in the water for several days, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact cause of death. There were no obvious wounds like gunshots or stabbings, but investigators began working on the theory of strangulation or forced drowning. The condition of the body suggested that the victim was probably still alive when she was thrown into the water. Formal identification of the victim only came the next day, through a fingerprint exam. The name that popped up in the database was Misty Morse, the young woman who had left home 3 days earlier and never returned. Once identified, the investigation took on a new phase. Who would want to kill Misty? What could have driven someone to commit such a brutal crime? And how did her body end up in a remote river? In a spot that seemed purposely chosen to make it hard to find? These were just a few of the questions the police needed to answer. The first step was to retrace her last movements. Misty's mom was interviewed and confirmed that her daughter had received a call just before leaving the house. But who made the call? The technology back then didn't allow for easy tracking of phone calls. Also, the fact that Misty's phone was missing meant the cops couldn't access her recent contacts or call logs. In Misty's room, only a few things caught the detective's attention. Her purse was still there, but without her driver's license or phone. This suggested that she had intended to come back soon, but something got in the way. The investigators also looked into her social life and discovered that, in the past few months, she had met some new people. Among them, two guys stood out: Teddy, a recent acquaintance with a criminal record, and Bobby, a man she'd only gone out with once, but who had become obsessively fixated on her. Misty Morse's death didn't seem like a random crime. The specific way her body was found pointed to a meticulous killer. Someone with a solid grasp of nautical techniques and a method for hiding bodies. The investigators knew they were dealing with someone who had planned every detail, but they still didn't know who it was. On the morning of July 23, 2000, a retired judge stepped out to tend to his garden, right by the river in Rhode Island. The water was calm, mirroring the gray sky on a sweltering day. While mowing the lawn, something unusual along the bank caught his eye. Something was slowly floating, moving with the gentle sway of the current. At first, he thought it was the carcass of a large animal, maybe a dead deer or an abandoned dog. But as he got closer, a strong, unmistakable smell of decay hit him and turned his stomach. That's when he realized it wasn't an animal. It was a human body. Finding Misty Morse's body transformed what had started as a simple disappearance into a brutal, premeditated homicide. The police now had to piece together the victim's final steps, figure out who might have had a motive to kill her, and most importantly, uncover how her body ended up in the river, tied up and wrapped in materials that clearly pointed to an experienced, meticulous killer. The investigation's first step was to retrace the moments leading up to her disappearance. Her mom recounted that, on the night of July 20th, Misty was at home when she got a phone call. The conversation was short, and shortly after, she left. She didn't say where she was going or who she was meeting, but she sounded confident, not showing any nervousness or hesitation. The lack of advanced technology to track calls complicated the police work. Phone records from that era couldn't pinpoint the number that had called, making it impossible to know who made that last contact. With no clear leads, the investigators focused on the victim's room. There they found her purse with all her belongings except for two essential items: her cell phone and her driver's license. The fact that Misty had left without her car suggested that she must have found someone to give her a ride. From there, the police began looking into the people who'd been in contact with her recently. Soon, two names emerged as potential suspects: Teddy and Bobby. Teddy was a guy with a long criminal record. He'd already been convicted of offenses like assault, robbery, and even sexual violence. His name came up in the investigation because, in the weeks leading up to the crime, he had approached Misty through a co-worker of hers. Despite his shady past, when questioned, Teddy didn't seem rattled and cooperated fully with the police. He admitted that he'd gone out with Misty several times, but denied any involvement in her disappearance. By the end of the questioning, he even provided a DNA sample, making it clear he wasn't afraid of any connection to the crime. The second suspect, Bobby, raised even more red flags. He'd only been on a date with Misty once, but according to her friends, he didn't take too kindly to her not wanting to pursue things further. After their encounter, he became insistent, sending her constant messages and trying to persuade her to meet up again. Misty had even mentioned to acquaintances that he seemed obsessive and that his persistence was really getting on her nerves. During questioning, Bobby let slip an unexpected detail. He said he still had Misty's driver's license. According to him, during their single outing, she'd handed over her documents to him since she wasn't big on carrying them. But she never asked for them back. That explanation didn't sit well with the detectives, especially considering it had been weeks since their meeting, and Misty would surely have noticed her license was missing. The fact that her license disappeared on the night of the crime and was found with Bobby made the police take him very seriously as a suspect. Even so, there wasn't any solid evidence tying him to the murder. He allowed the investigators to search his house, and nothing incriminating turned up. Also, Bobby never served in the Navy, which didn't match the initial profile the police had drawn for the likely killer, someone with knowledge about boats and nautical techniques. But before they could completely rule him out, Bobby mentioned a name that would change the course of the investigation: Brent Hack. Brent was an ex-boyfriend of Misty's. According to Bobby, she had once mentioned that their relationship was turbulent and that Brent was aggressive and controlling. And most importantly, he had served in the Navy, which would explain the specific knots used to tie the victim's body, as well as the type of adhesive tape and plastic bags found at the scene. The police then shifted their focus to this new lead. Could they have finally found the real culprit? The police were called immediately. Minutes later, the first officers arrived and quickly cordoned off the crime scene. The current had carried the body close to the bank, but pulling it out wasn't going to be easy. The advanced state of decomposition made handling it risky. Any sudden movement could compromise the evidence. Plus, part of the body was submerged and wrapped in unusual materials, which indicated that the victim might have been tied or contained in some way. To retrieve the body without jeopardizing the clues, the rescue team used a special tarp, water-permeable yet sturdy enough to wrap the body. As soon as they pulled the victim from the river and placed her on a secure surface for a preliminary examination, it became clear that this wasn't just a case of drowning. It was a brutal murder. The victim was completely naked. Her wrists and ankles were tightly bound with a specific kind of nautical rope, the same type used on boats. Moreover, large strips of adhesive tape were wrapped around part of her face and mouth, a material similar to what's used to seal leaks on ships. On her feet, plastic bags had been tightly secured, probably to keep the body from resurfacing. However, something had gone wrong. The bags were torn, allowing the body to float and eventually be discovered. Forensics examined the remains right there by the riverbank. There were no signs of knife wounds or gunshot injuries. The lack of cuts or extensive bruising suggested that the cause of death might have been strangulation or forced drowning. But, given the advanced decomposition, pinpointing it precisely would require more detailed lab analysis. The body was then transported to the medical examiner's office, where official identification was made the next day. Fingerprints confirmed what the detectives had long suspected. It was Misty Morse, the young woman who had left home 3 days earlier and never came back. With the victim's identity confirmed, the investigation took an even darker turn. Forensics collected all the items found near the body. One peculiar detail caught their attention. Some dark hair was stuck to the adhesive tape used to cover the victim's mouth. An initial analysis revealed that these hairs didn't belong to Misty. If they were from the potential attacker, they could be the key to identifying the culprit. The next stage of the investigation would be crucial: retracing Misty's final steps, pinpointing the possible suspects, and figuring out how and why she was brutally murdered. What began as a disappearance was now unraveling as a meticulously planned homicide. But who would commit such a cruel crime? And, most importantly, why? The discovery of Misty Morse's body turned a missing person case into a brutal, premeditated murder. The police had to retrace the victim's last steps, figure out who might have wanted her dead, and, most importantly, unravel how she ended up in the river, tied up and wrapped in materials that gave away an experienced, meticulous killer. They started by going over the moments before she disappeared. Her mom said that on the night of July 20th, Misty was at home when she got a call. The conversation was short, and shortly after, she left. She didn't say where she was headed or who she was meeting, but she sounded confident, not showing any signs of nervousness or hesitation. The lack of advanced call tracking technology back then made life tough for the cops. Phone records from that time couldn't pinpoint the number that called, so they couldn't figure out who made that last contact. With no clear leads, the investigators turned their attention to the victim's room. There they found her purse with all her stuff, except for two crucial items, her cell phone and driver's license. The fact that Misty left without her car suggested she must have found someone to give her a ride. With that in mind, the police started looking into the people who had been in touch with her recently. Soon, two names popped up as potential suspects: Teddy and Bobby. Teddy was a guy with a sketchy background. He'd already been convicted for assault, robbery, and even sexual violence. His name came up in the investigation because, in the weeks leading up to the crime, he had approached Misty through one of her co-workers. Despite his shady past, when questioned, Teddy didn't seem rattled at all and cooperated fully with the police. He admitted he had gone out with Misty a few times, but he denied any involvement in her disappearance. By the end of the interrogation, he even gave a DNA sample, making it clear he wasn't afraid of being linked to the crime. The second suspect, Bobby, raised even more red flags. He'd only been on a date with Misty once, but according to her friends, he didn't take too kindly to her lack of interest in taking things further. After their meeting, he became overly insistent, sending her non-stop messages and trying to convince her to see him again. Misty even mentioned to some friends that he came off as obsessive and that his constant attention was really making her uncomfortable. During his interrogation, Bobby let slip something unexpected. He said he still had Misty's driver's license. According to him, during their one and only date, she'd given him her documents to hold onto since she wasn't big on carrying them, and she never asked for them back. That explanation didn't sit well with the detectives, especially since weeks had passed since that meeting, and Misty would have definitely noticed her license was missing. The fact that her license disappeared on the night of the crime and then ended up with Bobby made the police take him very seriously as a suspect. Even so, there wasn't any solid evidence tying him to the murder. He let the investigators search his house, and nothing incriminating turned up. Plus, Bobby never served in the Navy, which didn't match the profile the police were starting to piece together of the likely killer, someone with knowledge of boats and nautical techniques. But before they could completely write him off, Bobby mentioned a name that would change the course of the investigation: Brent Hack. Brent was an ex-boyfriend of Misty's. According to Bobby, she had mentioned that their relationship was extremely turbulent and that Brent had an aggressive, controlling streak. And most importantly, he had served in the Navy, which would explain the specific knots used to tie the victim's body, as well as the type of adhesive tape and plastic bags found at the scene. The investigation into Misty Morse's death took a new turn when Brent Hack's name emerged as a potential suspect. Not only was he her ex, but he also had the technical know-how to pull off the crime with precision. Digging into his background, the detectives found out that Brent lived near where the body was found. Plus, his Navy experience and current job as a charter boat captain made him the perfect suspect. The adhesive tape used at the scene was a specific type of naval-grade material, and the ropes used to tie Misty up were the same ones you'd find on boats. It didn't seem like a coincidence at all. The police decided to play it safe and called Brent in for questioning. When he arrived, he showed barely any emotion while talking about the case. Unlike the other suspects who were visibly nervous or flat out denied everything, Brent came off as cool and calculated. He said that although he'd dated Misty in the past, they'd broken up over a year ago and only kept in touch occasionally. He denied any involvement in her disappearance or death, claiming he was at home on the night of the crime and hadn't seen her in weeks. However, his attitude caught the investigators' attention. He didn't seem the least bit affected by the brutal murder of someone he'd once been involved with. Moreover, when the detectives asked if he had talked to Misty on the day she vanished, Brent hesitated before answering. He eventually admitted that he had called her that night, but insisted it was just to clear up a rumor floating around among mutual friends that Misty was pregnant with his baby. That revelation set off alarms. None of Misty's close friends had ever mentioned any suspicion of a pregnancy, and there were no records of her ever saying anything like that. Yet, the very fact that Brent was so bothered by that rumor, enough to call her, opened up a new theory. Maybe he killed her out of fear that a supposed baby would ruin his life and his current relationship. The police dug deeper. They got a warrant to search Brent Hack's house, and what they found was chilling. First off, in the kitchen, the officers discovered plastic packages identical to the ones tied around Misty's legs. They were sealed and came from the same production batch, which suggested they might have come straight from there. In the garage, the investigators found nautical ropes identical to the ones used to tie up the victim. Upon analyzing them, they noticed that they were knotted with the same techniques used by sailors and Navy officers, exactly as the crime scene experts had described. Another key find was a roll of special boat sealing adhesive tape, the exact same model that had been used on the victim. The chemical makeup of the tape was unusual and not something you'd normally get unless you were involved in the maritime world. For the detectives, this left no doubt that the killer was someone from that scene. Even with all these clues, the evidence was still circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses or records placing Brent with Misty on the night of the crime. His alibi was weak, but not completely shot. The prosecutor in charge of the case was hesitant to bring charges, arguing that without definitive physical evidence, it would be tough to secure a conviction. The detectives found themselves in a bind. They had a suspect whose guilt seemed obvious, but they were missing that one crucial piece that would turn a case full of hints into an unshakable charge. They needed something more. Fast. For 2 years, the murder of Misty Morse remained unsolved. The police had a strong suspect in Brent Hack, with plenty of circumstantial evidence pointing his way, but without concrete proof linking him to the crime, the case stalled. The prosecutor refused to take him to trial, fearing that a jury wouldn't find enough proof to convict him. Meanwhile, Brent kept a low profile, avoiding any drama with the media or the police. However, in 2002, forensic technology took an unexpected turn. Animal DNA analysis started being used in criminal investigations. The team went back over the items collected at the crime scene and remembered one detail that had been overlooked: some dark hair strands stuck to the adhesive tape used to muffle Misty. Back then, they didn't have the tech to analyze animal DNA, but with these new methods, the investigators saw the perfect opportunity. They reviewed Brent Hack's background and recalled a key detail. He had a dark-haired dog, a mix of German Shepherd and Rottweiler, which Misty had actually given him when they were together. If the hair found on the tape matched that dog's, Brent wouldn't have any way to deny his involvement in the crime. The police took samples of the dog's fur and compared them to the hair strands on the tape. The result was conclusive. The hairs were from the same animal. This meant that, at the time of the crime, Brent had likely been in contact with the tape used to tie up Misty. That was the missing piece that turned all the circumstantial evidence into rock-solid proof. With this new revelation, the prosecutors didn't hesitate. In October 2002, Brent Hack was finally arrested and formally charged with the kidnapping and murder of Misty Morse. At trial, he stuck to his story, denying any involvement and claiming that someone was trying to frame him. But the pile of evidence was overwhelming. The body's location near his home, the nautical materials matching those used in the crime, his dodgy behavior during the first interrogation, and now the forensic proof linking his dog's hair. The trial was intense, and while the defense tried to argue that everything was just circumstantial, the prosecutors painted a very convincing picture. Brent Hack, upon hearing the rumor about Misty possibly being pregnant, feared that it would wreck his personal and professional life. Driven by that paranoia, he lured Misty into a meeting, possibly under the pretense of discussing the rumor. There, he overpowered and immobilized her, and, using his nautical know-how, tried to make sure her body would never be found. The plan failed, and fate had it that Misty's body eventually surfaced, ensuring her story would never be forgotten. After days of testimonies and deliberations, the jury found Brent Hack guilty. The sentence was harsh. 2 life sentences, one for kidnapping and one for the murder of Misty Morse. Brent accepted the verdict without showing a hint of emotion. He tried to appeal, but every option was shut down. Today, Brent Hack remains behind bars, serving his sentence without the chance of parole. Misty Morse's case has become a prime example of how forensic technology can turn the tide in solving crimes, and of the persistence of investigators in seeking justice, even when it all seemed lost.